You know, that was a little game we're playing. But we're training, huh?
Uh-huh.
We're training for the real thing. And when all of this ended, when Friday afternoon came around, and we spent a whole 5 days, you know, out on the job, I'd get a flag. He'd fly the flag. Pass in review, you know. Pass, in other words, he wanted me to line up my 4 destroyers and pass in review, make a parade out of it.
A big
And what
boat
I
parade.
would do,
Yeah, a big
I
ship
would
parade.
line up the destroyers, and the carriers steaming at 20 knots heading for Long Beach, because we were based at Long Beach. And I'd line the destroyers in a column, 500 yards apart, and I'd come at 25 knots, right down the carrier's throats. And we're closing at what? 45 knots, 20 and 25, which is 4,500 yards every 3 minutes. That's 2.25 miles, every 3 minutes. So you have to be careful, otherwise you're gonna have a collision. So somewhere, I'd grown up on the use of signals. Because when World War II broke, voice radio was just coming in. And voice radio had a lot of static and transmissions that couldn't be heard and whatnot. So we relied a lot on flags. Semaphore, flashing light, and flags, because you had a signal book. And if you flew, for instance, when I would turn 45 degrees, I would put 4 answering turn. We had a turn signal. Turn was you turned, all ships turned. That's a turn signal. A Korpen signal was a column you turned, one at a time. So that when you went Korpen 9, you turned 90 degrees, but you all followed one another. So when you completed, the 4 ships completed, you were still in line. But when you turned, you weren't in line. You turned and you had, so I'd come down his throat, and at an appropriate time, maybe at 5,000-6,000 yards, I'd fly the flag, you know, get ready for answering turn. And we'd turn 45 degrees. And of course, the beauty was the wake, huh? At that speed, when you turn 45 degrees, that 4 white streaks would show up behind the ships. Turn another. And then when I turned, I crossed his bow, and then I got on his beam, and then I'd make my final turn. And then he would fly, Tear Victor George. That was Tear, T, Victor, V, G, George. That meant, that's a traditional Navy signal for well done.
Yeah, salute.
Well done. So, you know, life wasn't always serious, but it was when I had the minesweeper, and I had to go out emergency, and I didn't pick anybody up. And by then, others, Coast Guard had gotten there first, I guess, because they were always at the ready. But the night the Wasp cut the Hobson in 2. The Hobson was a converted destroyer carrying about 250 men. The Wasp was like a Yorktown, an aircraft carrier, not yet converted to a CVS, and the Wasp was ahead. Hobson was ahead of the Wasp, and for some reason, the Wasp went this way, and the Hobson went that way, and the Hobson was crossing the bow of the Hobson. The destroyer was crossing the bow of the Wasp, and the Wasp cut her right in 2. 2 big pieces. She sank. 185 men went down that night, lost. 185 men. So my entire naval career, you know, I got to solid training as a young ensign, because again, we started from scratch. You didn't have voice radio, you didn't have radar. So you learn to use the binoculars. You learn to estimate ranges. In fact, the first radar we got in Boston Naval Shipyard, and it was a big mattress, we called it. It was a search radar. It wasn't a radar we could use with the guns and whatnot. And it had a PPI or a little screen of this big, you know. And we used little niches on the screen. If you had a target, that was it. So it's all fundamentals. I'm talking 40, 41, 42, you know. And then when the war moved along.
Yeah, did it evolve quickly?
Yeah, gradually, yeah.
Okay.
So that by the time I got to my second ship, we actually had a Mark IV radar which controlled the guns. And you had, on the Aaron Ward, for instance, the ship that was hit by the kamikazes and didn't sink, was built here in Long Beach, and that was built in '44, so. But in the Atlantic, when we were chasing the German submarine, we had to borrow the Brits' ASDIC, anti-submarine detection something, ASDIC. In fact, I went to spend a week in Canada, in Halifax, Nova Scotia, getting some training on the ASDIC, because we had not developed anything. We, being America, didn't have any active sonar. An active sonar is the ping. When World War II ended, we were still hydrophoning. Well, kind of listening.
Really?
For the when your listening devices didn't give you range as such, distance, whereas the ping gave you distance, so you could make an attack. But we were so inept, really, is the word, that on my first ship in the Caribbean, where we thought we had a submarine, and the sonarman who was operating this ASDIC, and the ASDIC was, you used actually a wheel that you turned to turn the ASDIC, which was on the bottom of the ship in the water, and in front of you, you had a range recorder. You didn't have any fancy devices, you know, they were horizontal. All we had was, because we used the stopwatch to get an idea of an ordinary stopwatch, and you had it was called a chemical recorder, because it used a chemical feature to a scribe that actually traced on paper and told you such things. If you looked and you used the stopwatch, you get a range rate. And if a range rate normally told you if the submarine is going away and you're overtaking it, and your range rate is, or maybe half your speed, you know that you're overtaking it. And then when your range rate, if he's coming in on you and your range rate is twice your speed, if he's making 10 knots and you're making 10 knots, that's a 20-knot range rate. If he's making 10 knots and you're making 10 knots, unless you increase speed, you've got a 0 range rate. Anyway, all these things always eventually, by training and just common sense, applied. And however, underwater things were always so much different, because the submarine, beautiful cylinder of steel,
Right.
We could have a couple of whales, or you could have a school of fish. And so this particular day, I remember the captain actually stopped the ship. We're going through the water, and the sonarman who's on the sonar, and he says, "Captain, I think he's crossing under our stern." and I think he's under the ship. And so the captain, without thinking, really, because we're dead in the water, he says, roll 2 600-pound depth charges. That's 1,200 pounds of TNT, and they go in the water, and they've got 50-foot settings. That's fairly shallow. And I remember I went after after part of the bridge to look aft and see. Well, we had a little way on, so it wasn't as though, because I think if the depth charges were directly under us as they exploded, and we were dead in the water, dead, we would have probably blown open the stern, and sank ourselves instead of the submarine. But we did lose power, everything went, circuit breakers tripped, seams were split, water leaked in, and that was the U.S. Navy in action in 1942 in the Caribbean. I was a young ensign with one stripe. Captain, I remember his name, little shorty guy, the class of 27, 1927, Commodore Paleman, bless it. But anyway, we survived the war. We gradually got better, and it was a long, bloody war. So, I don't know why I suddenly opened up like this, but what brought that to mind? Was that,
It was the newspaper. I can't remember.
was it the history of the Bush and Putin, or no?
Well, you were
Although
looking
I
at
got a
Jim's
nice-
picture.
Yeah, I got a nice letter from North Africa. I didn't cover North Africa, but we went to North Africa. I didn't cover, but I did cover coming all the way from Italy to Long Beach and meeting your grandma when I made that fateful trip ashore, and I invited her to attend the ship's commissioning.
Yeah, which ship?
She accepted, yeah.
Okay.
And that's where our romance started, I guess you'd say.
Which ship was it commissioning? Which ship do you know?
That was the Aaron Ward.
Okay, you were commissioning the Aaron Ward.
Yeah. And the paper I'll give you will have all the ships I was on. I could run down, kind of give you for the hour I have here, if you want a kind of a summary
Sure.
of the different ships I was on. Now, I won't cover, in other words, when I went to Naval Academy, I was 18. So I don't know how much, I know Laura in her questions, she said, your mom and dad, were they famous for anything? And I said, my mother and father were famous for being wonderful parents and raising a family. And my father was actually a gentleman who was loved in the community. And they both lived, to a good age, well into their 90s. Now, you probably didn't meet, but when you...
I met
Mother,
Yeah.
your great-grandma, I must have a picture or two of you.
Yeah,
'cause
I'm
I
sure.
did take pictures, yeah.
That was...
But anyway,
Number available.
but do you want me to start? Are you ready, or?
I'm trying to get the angle right.
Okay,
Let's see here. Let's see if this works.
the right angle,
It's all about the camera angle.
yeah. Is this just sound, audio?
It's good. You can just talk, and it'll pick it up.
Okay. So I won't get emotional, I won't get personnel, shipmates and all of that. I'll just go to tours and cover what the ship did and the jobs that I had. So I graduated from the Naval Academy in 1942, June. We all got in line, the graduating class, about 650 and we picked numbers out of a hat, and that number that you picked was the ship to which you'd be assigned. In most cases, there were about 25 went in the Marine Corps, and maybe others went into different types of jobs, but by and large, about 85 to 90% of the graduating class went to ships that would go off and fight the Germans or the Japanese. And just a quick little vignette, some classmates and dear friends of mine were not as lucky as I. They picked ships that were, one case within 6 weeks was sunk, and a fellow named Bayless Bell, I mentioned I wouldn't get emotional, but I always think of Bayless Bell from Parkersburg, Virginia. We were very close, dear friend, and he picked a 4-pipe destroyer that was sunk by the Japanese at Savo Island. So he's still there somewhere in the bottom of the Pacific. So, I mean, that's the way the ball happened to bounce, that some of us got ships that made it possible for us to survive the war. Others got ships that were sunk and were naturally disappeared from the scene.
Well, do you think that the camaraderie of the crew and the officers helped with the success of the ships? Like, not
Oh yeah,
getting-
that's pretty standard.
Yeah.
A ship actually, the morale of a ship has a lot to do with the guy that's commanding it, and then on top of that, it's just natural that a group of officers and men that are thrown together on a ship and are out at sea for weeks on end, months on end in some cases, have become close. And I don't recall, say, in my entire naval career, 20 of my 30 years were at sea, and I had, say, half a dozen commands. I don't recall any serious problem. In other words, there were no, there was no mayhem. There might have been a fight or two here and there, but in all honesty, except for what the enemy, like the Japanese killing some of my machine gunners on the Aaron Ward topside, I don't recall losing any men. I might just briefly mention, during Korea, I was a lieutenant commander. I had a APD, a converted destroyer escort that was redesigned to carry 125 officers and men called frogmen, or UDT, underwater demolition types. And when the ship conducted, and I was given the responsibility actually as the commander of the task element, overall each of the raids was my responsibility. And I can remember when the boat officer, Lieutenant Mahan, returned to the ship with a crew, and the South Koreans, all the South Koreans, there were about 4 or 5 of them in that particular boat, that 2 of them I think had been killed and the other 3 wounded, but my men were untouched. And when he came up to the bridge and said, "Captain, I want you to come down to the boat deck," after we picked up the boats and were clearing the area so we could go out in the Sea of Japan. And I counted, say, something like 15 or 16 bullet holes in that boat. And yet my bow hook and stern hook, my engineer, and my radioman, 4 on that boat, and High Man, who was a boat officer, and the assault boat coxswain, those 7 who were assigned to my job for some reason were untouched. It was the South Koreans that took the brunt of the bullets that entered that boat. There are all kinds of other times. Of course, on the Aaron Ward, when we were at Okinawa, I wasn't that fortunate. I was personally, and the people up on the bridge and the director, forward part of the ship, it was untouched. But by and large, the rest of the ship took quite a beating, and so there were very few survivors that were topside that had manned their guns, because these kamikazes came right in. And once they came in, we didn't have the gunnery really to shoot them out of the sky and destroy them, you know. But anyway, so I went going back again, first ship was the Eberly, DD 430, what they call a 1630, 1,600 tons without the ammo and the oil and whatnot, but she carried 5 single 5-inch mounts. I was assigned as assistant gunnery officer. I stood watches to learn the business of becoming an officer of the deck. An OOD, officer of the deck, is a job that you aspire to, because it gives you the responsibility of representing the captain of the ship. The captain can't always be on the pilot house, so the officer of the deck takes his place, and the captain can sit in his chair or go in the sea cabin and maybe catch a little nap or something. But anyway, so that ship, the first assignment that I recall, we convoyed a group up of merchant ships with other destroyers, and we took them up to Iceland, up into the North Atlantic, and that's where I got my first taste of heavy weather. And believe me, I was seasick, I would say 85% of the time. But eventually, after I'd say a couple of months, I eventually learned to cope. But we turned that convoy over to British destroyers, and they took it on to England or up to our other friendly countries in Northern Europe. And we did that twice, as I recall, and then eventually we were assigned during the winter, I think 42, 43, the South Atlantic, and we reported to a place called Para Belém at the mouth of the Amazon River, and we operated out of Brazil for about 6 months, and our primary job was to look for blockade runners coming up from South America, from the Far East, and taking their goods to Germany. And we had occasion to intercept one blockade runner, and as luck would have it, I had the watch, which meant I was on the bridge, and consequently the captain gave orders for the visit and search party to go over to this German blockade runner, a merchant ship carrying this valuable cargo. And we had an aircraft carrier, the Santee,